Welcome to Disruptive Successor, a show for next generation leaders in family businesses and entrepreneurs who want to disrupt the status quo and take their existing business to a whole new level. We all know that what got us here isn't going to get us there. This show will provide inspiration, advice, and resources to help you create massive impact. This podcast is sponsored by myself, Jonathan Goldhill, and my company, the Goldhill Group, where we provide coaching for growing companies. I'm Jonathan Goldhill, and my purpose is simple: to guide entrepreneurial leaders in family businesses towards more freedom and fulfillment. I want entrepreneurs to get clarity around the changes that will make them and their businesses more successful so they can experience the same freedom I've enjoyed in my life. Our proven practices challenge business owners to think differently about their business and how they're running it, and quite literally become game changers in our clients' companies. Learn more at thegoldhillgroup.com website, where you can schedule your free strategy session. Hi, Jonathan Goldhill here, and welcome back to another episode of the Disruptive Successor Show. And today I have Rustom Desai, who has recently joined Cornell University's S.C. Johnson College of Business faculty after spending 25 years as a global technology executive with Corning Incorporated. Cornell is also where Rustom earned his MBA many years earlier, following getting a degree in engineering from the Delhi College of Engineering. During his past 25 years, he has built and led businesses to scale in developed and emerging markets and across multiple tech markets, including semiconductors, consumer electronics, and optical communications. While living and working in the US, China, Taiwan, and India, Rustom has had the opportunity to create and in some cases dismantle strategic alliances of all flavors. Rustom has spent 20 years on public, private, and family business advisory boards. Through these and other career experiences, he has developed unique, up-close and personal experience in the area of family-owned company governance and management, including that of his very own family business, which we're going to dive into with a presentation. So, Rustom, welcome to the show today.
Thank you for having me, Jonathan. It's a pleasure.
So, let's start off with an interesting question. So you were at Corning, which is arguably a technology / manufacturing company. And you're now on the faculty teaching about strategic alliances. And you've got to be asking yourself the question, why aren't there more families in tech? Why aren't there more family businesses that are tech? And let's maybe put manufacturing aside and talk about that. So Rustom, why? What's the answer to this question, do you think?
Well, I think part of the answer lies in how we define tech in the year 2021, right? It's all about fast pace, quick turnover, short life cycle, sort of not the kind of environment where the patient money that family business is used to investing in. And so what lands up being the source of funding in those spaces tends to be the VC, PE type model of investor, where they have a portfolio approach to doing business. It's a different time in the evolution of tech. I'm sure at some point in the future, families will participate very vibrantly and actively in tech.
Will tech have to just get very mature for that to happen? And does that mean that the returns from tech investments will no longer be what VCs and PE firms are looking for?
I think what's going to happen, in my assessment, is the time frame of expected return versus the risk, right? Mm-hmm. Family enterprise does brilliantly in a space where patient money is required. Wall Street is not patient, VC is not patient, PE is not patient. So when the funding requirements from these industries are going to require patient money, that's possibly the time where family money shows up to save the day.
Okay, so patient working capital is the words of family business. That's where the money comes from, and that's what they're willing to wait for long returns, long periods to get their return on investment. So
very often, yes.
All right, so you have an interesting family story to tell, and I'm going to put some slides up here that we can share for those who are following along on YouTube and want to watch this. And that's the story of JRD Holdings, which was your family's business, if you will, your father's business. And so as I walk through some of these slides, tell us a little bit about the history. I mean, some of you might, who are listening to this and are old enough, might know the name Kelvinator because they were involved in refrigerators and home appliances in the United States. So Kelvinator of India is a related business, and your dad joined as an employee in 1963. So take us through the story here as I project these slides for people who are listening.
So my dad was an engineer by training, and he was in the early 60s invited to join this company called Kelvinator of India, which was formed by a combination of mostly Indian capital and technology that was acquired through a license agreement with Kelvinator in the US. He spent the next few years building the company up and also rose eventually to become CEO, acquiring a controlling stake in the company, and then eventually took it public as well.
Gotcha. Okay. And so this was happening, tell us, like in the 80s and 90s. And, Kelvinator is quite a big business. They had over 5,000 people and revenues of $120 million.
That's right. In the 80s and 90s, it was all about securing that position in the refrigerator space where the company had greater than 50% share in the market, was one of only two players that was government mandated. And it sort of moving into expanding the scope of the business into a variety of different, sometimes related, sometimes not related lines. For example, the manufacture of motor scooters in collaboration with a company out of Italy called Garelli, the manufacture of microwave ovens with White Consolidated, another US company, and the manufacture of cash registers with a Japanese company called Omron. So he had alliances written all through his DNA without perhaps knowing it.
Interesting. One of the things that I have taught clients around strategy is stealing a page from Jack Welch and General Electric's idea that you should either be number one or number two or get out of that industry. Was Kelvinator, they were number one in India in refrigerators. What about any of these others? Do you think or know if they were number one or number two in any of these, or if they had
they were first to market in cash registers. They were first to market in microwave ovens, and so they were market makers more than anything else. So they were absolutely positioned for number one, and that's a good segue to the next slide.
Okay, awesome. So tell us.
So what happens in the early 1990s is the Indian economy is on the verge of collapse. The government is forced to allow foreign companies to invest money in India. My late father, Mr. JRD Desai, has some choices to make. He says his choices are, do I have deep enough pockets to compete with the foreign investors that are going to show up? Do I want to form an alliance with one of them, or do I want to sell? And the choice he made at the time was, he said, I'm going to put this company up for sale. I think that it will be best managed as part of a global, deep-pocketed white goods company. And it's time for me to do that. And so he put it up for sale, eventually bought over by Whirlpool of the US. And then the sale proceeds went through to himself as a shareholder and to these investment companies that we'll talk about in a little bit. And of course, the public that held shares.
Gotcha. And so walk us through the slide, proceeds of the sale and a web of entities.
Yes. So a lot of the, sorry, go ahead.
No, they were looking for their next big gig, it looks like.
Correct. So a lot of the proceeds from the sale went into a group of companies that we eventually rechristened to be the JRD Holdings Group. And they had funds. My dad took a few of his senior executives from Kelvinator over to the JRD Group, and they started to look for the next big thing. The interesting thing from a family business standpoint, though, was that there was really no succession plan. All three of his children, myself and my two sisters, were all professionals and hadn't at this point made a choice to change that in any way. And so as he looked at kind of the next big gig, he was looking at it by himself.
Interesting. So now take us through, we're in the early 2000s, and what's going on in the business at this time?
So he and his team are kind of looking to rebuild the grandeur of Kelvinator. They go through a few what I would call failed adventures, right? Different business ideas that were brought to them that they invested in and didn't turn out to be the golden egg that they hoped they would be. And at the same time, unfortunately, my dad, his health started to fail as well. And so it was a bad time for him personally. And his vision of rebuilding the empire wasn't exactly panning out the way he had hoped it would.
And you weren't leaving Corning to go jump in and save your dad. And some family businesses do this, by the way, Rustom. I'm sure you've seen it or heard it. Like they feel an obligation. And by the way, what I've noticed and heard is that people maybe of Indian descent feel more of a sense of obligation out of the culture to their parents to do this. I've seen this with some Pakistani and Filipino families. That the obligation to the family is very strong. So,
Jonathan, you hit something that's very, very close to my heart. And one of the things I respect my dad for most is that as I was forming my opinion and my viewpoint as to whether or not I joined the family business, I always knew it was his heartfelt desire that I did, but he never forced it upon me. He would ask every now and then, hey, have you thought of coming back and joining the business? And my answer at the time was always not now. It was never no. It was just not now. I got this one more thing to do, and I got this one more thing to do. Now, I realize in retrospect that it was not necessarily the best way of approaching saying no.
Right.
So, when I'm talking to young family business owners today, I'm always encouraging them to be thoughtful about what it is they really want and to start that dialogue with family early. I think I made it difficult on my dad because I never gave him an unequivocal answer, and he still supported me through all of my various professional endeavors.
But you were supporting him too, were you not? You started moonlighting to stop the bleeding that was going on in the companies that they had invested in and the businesses. What was that like? I mean,
so I was fortunately, I guess, sent back to India on assignment to start manufacturing and build a business for them in India. At the same time, my siblings and I were talking about, the state of these family-owned companies and how they really needed some help with direction setting. And in fact, it's my wife who continued to push me to start getting involved, in my spare time, of which I had none. And so I started to spend essentially weekends working with my dad and his team to try and first figure out what the hell was going on, and then to try and find a path to improving the status of those various companies.
Right. And so let's talk about your plan. So it was restructure the business, align the family, and maximize value and independence for the next generation. Tell us a little bit more about what that looks like.
Now, I will admit, it sounds a lot more focused when you put it on a slide than it was at the time.
Hindsight's 2020, my friend.
Of course it is. And you can always build a slide about the past.
Exactly, right.
At the time, it smelled a lot more like just panic. Like, oh my God, we've got to stop the bleed. So we kind of did three things. The first, it's not necessarily in that order, but the first most important thing that I think we needed to do was my siblings and myself to get together and have a conversation with my dad that we're here to support you. We're going to try and do the best for you and for your business. Our objectives are not to take anything away from you. And I think that was important for him to hear. He needed to hear it many times before he got comfortable with it, but eventually he did.
And that's a lesson, by the way, that a lot of parents need to hear from the successor, that we're not going to sell the family farm, so to speak. We're not going to, I'm going to use another metaphor here. We're not going to pull the wool out, the rug out from underneath you, or the wool over your eyes. So trust is a really big issue when going from one generation to the next. And I think, Rustom, that I'll say that that's probably the number one factor that inhibits the development of a written succession plan is the ability to get to that place where trust and like fairness, authenticity is fully realized by all parties.
You're so right. Because especially in my dad's situation, he had not had the opportunity to have any of us ever actually work in the family business. And here we show up with all kinds of opinions about what should and shouldn't be done with the business. And if I were him at that point, I would ask the question, where were you when I needed you?
Right.
Right. And
Yeah.
unfortunately, we don't have an answer, but we were there at that time and we were really committed to making sure, if for nothing else, just for the sake of him spending his golden years in a state of sort of being positive and thinking positively about his life rather than going through potentially cycles of failed businesses.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
All right. So now we're at the place where JRD Holdings is formed.
Right.
Walk us through the points on this slide, please.
So we kind of rechristened this web of companies, JRD Holdings, obviously in respect for our father. Mm-hmm. He had a few enterprises that were being operated through these companies. We wound them all down. About 60% of the staff was asked to retire at that point. A lot of them had been his partners in crime in a very good way for over 40 years at that point. So that those weren't all easy discussions, but we thought it was best for the business and for them to have those discussions. We fundamentally stopped doing any trading activity in all of the companies. We focused all the capital and the investments on putting them into marketable securities and sort of in the investment side until mm-hmm. such time that we may in the future have a plan to do something different. And then we shifted the team capabilities from people going out there prospecting for trading opportunities to being people who can manage a family office.
Yeah. Interesting.
So it kind of turned away from being a web of trading companies to an investment holding company type structure.
And so it's an interesting transition when you go from an operating business to basically an investment management business. And the skills that got you there or here weren't necessarily going to be the same skills that are going to get you there. And the people that got you here aren't going to be the people that get you there. So I imagine that can be pretty challenging for families going through the transition of exiting an operating company and forming an investment management company.
For sure, Jonathan. And you've seen this a bazillion times in your career. Family businesses have a special bond with their people. Mm-hmm. Right. And to make decisions that appeared to be in the best interest of the family business, but not necessarily in the best interest of every individual that had been by my dad's side for 40 plus years was not easy.
Sure.
And not all of them bought into it. And, that was tough. It was very tough on them, on us, on my dad.
Yeah. And, look, it sounds to me like with your background in strategic alliances during the many years that you were at Corning, you were probably pretty good at reading the tea leaves here and knowing who was going to be a good fit and who was not, or what businesses might be a good fit and what businesses were not. I mean, is that true? Do you bring like a methodology to this sort of madness?
Well, we all have the lenses through which we see opportunities, right?
Sure.
And to me, the two major lenses that I looked at when I saw Dad's portfolio at this time mm-hmm. was, what are you doing that the other guy next door isn't doing? How are you bringing value in a way that somebody else can't?
Right.
A. And B, is there something here that can be enduring, that can survive over time? And if the answer to those two is little or nothing, and probably not a long time, not a great business to be in.
Yeah. I mean, simply put, we call that like, do you have a unique value proposition or a unique selling proposition? And is there something in the world, Jim Collins, I think used to talk about, that you can be the absolute best at, that differentiates you? And this is a really hard thing for many companies, especially companies maybe that have been around for generations and companies that are just getting started to identify.
Absolutely. So that was kind of the lens, and it was as flawed as anybody else's lens would be, but we use that. And then, of course, we also started to clearly document succession plans. And, after my dad's passing, my siblings and I started to work very closely on what I call a governance agreement between the three of us to ensure that we found that right balance between giving each other flexibility, but also being, on the right side of good governance. And that's a balance that we continue to focus on today.
And do you have family meetings do you have a structured set of governance practices where the family gets together on a periodic basis ideally should this be happening? Because I think, again, trust is what's the foundation of any kind of agreement, no matter what.
No question about it.
Even in an acquisition, trust has got to be there.
No question about it.
And I think these are, if you don't have regular governance meetings, trust can sort of wane because you're not checking in with each other.
For sure. So there's a couple of things we do. One is that we've kind of distributed the roles and responsibilities across the three of us. And while we don't necessarily need a corporate structure per se or an org structure, one of my sisters takes care of essentially people-related and administration-related issues. The other one takes care of legal issues, and I take care of what I would call investment and business type issues. And so our sandboxes are reasonably well defined.
Right.
The second thing is we operate it as though it were a professional company with outside shareholders and stakeholders that may not necessarily be at the table. And what I mean by that is we have our regular cadence of board meetings. We have our regular cadence of annual general meetings, even though it's just the three of us as the key stakeholders.
Great.
We keep a very regular cadence to the discussions and the topics and so on and so forth. And that's the surface of it. That's and then one level down, obviously we have an office, and every time I'm in India, we have meetings in the office and we bring the whole team together and so on and so forth. So we try and keep alignment. It's not always easy, but we try very hard.
I think the other thing that's really hard and where things break down is communication. So let's, for instance, say you make a decision that you think, well, this doesn't really require communication, but one of your siblings thought you should have communicated around that. You're laughing because I'm hitting a funny bone, I think. I mean, this is a hard thing to document and say, well, you need to discuss these things, but you don't have to bring these things to us. I mean, how do you deal with that? And by the way, you're 12,000 miles away from them right now? I mean, whatever the number is. I mean,
so there was, I would say that, as with most teams, there was kind of a, forming process that we went through. And there were times when it wasn't very clear as to what should and shouldn't be communicated. And to the credit of, I think, all three of us, when in doubt, we communicated more.
Right.
And then we gave the others the opportunity to say, hey, you really didn't need to tell us that.
Right. I think it's always good to over communicate,
So, and we're really focused on the trust stuff. We really are, because it holds the family together. So if for no other reason, it holds the family together.
But look, I know this is something you're really passionate about. You've had experience with this generational transition. And these are hard conversations to have with family members, with business, with employees, but it's really critical to the survival of the enterprise. So congratulations, first of all,
thank you.
On navigating through that and understanding what's really important to the family across those different generations. So what's next for you now?
So my strategy right now at a personal level, sort of, in terms of professional fulfillment, has a couple of legs. One is, of course, I teach at Cornell. That's my alma mater, and I came back here last year to teach at the business school. I really, really enjoy that, and that's something I'd like to continue to do. I'm also on a few boards, and board work keeps me excited. And then there's always the possibility that at some point between now and the end of time, either myself or one of my siblings drum up a brand new idea of how we're going to change the world, and we use the JRD Holdings structure to make that life-changing step into a new business.
Yep.
So there's always the possibility of that. I just can't tell you today what that might be or when.
Yeah,
but we're looking, and I'm sure one of us is going to find something.
Can you talk to me and our listeners around ownership, governance, and management? I had a couple of interesting speakers. One, an earlier podcast was with Josh Barron, who just wrote a book called The Family Business Handbook. And we talked on the podcast about like the 4 different rooms that conversations need to be had. Like, one is the ownership room. Like, we don't talk about management stuff in the ownership room. One is the management room. Can you talk to us about what your thoughts are on how to divide or put the right conversation in the right room so that there isn't this lack of clarity, blending of boundaries, confusion of roles? What are some of your thoughts? I mean,
I'd say as a second generation family, we're currently learning our way through those boundaries. We're very aware that they exist. We don't always get them exactly right.
Yeah.
And so when, there's been a time when we've been trying to think of how can we simplify the ownership structure. And we spend a lot of time and focus on that. Many months passed by, we realized there's no economical way to simplify the structure. So that was in the ownership bucket, and we generally kept the conversation in the ownership bucket.
Right.
When you're talking about governance versus management, it's a little bit more difficult to do when your scope is only investment. We still try and manage it, that, the 3 of us as 1/3 owners are here to govern. We're not here to manage. But it's very difficult to manage that diaphragm between governance and management when it comes to just investment companies, because all we really have is a family office at this point. And so sometimes we do overstep a little bit. And then, one or the other will say, hey, is that really our job? And then we have a dialogue about it. Yeah. So as I said, we're learning what the boundaries are, but it's very important to have those be clear, especially when we as a family start talking about what's in it for the next generation, right? We haven't got to that yet. That's when the ownership, governance, management piece is going to become really, really important.
Super important. So I think one of the tools of my trade is the concept of an accountability chart. It's a little bit different than an organization chart, because the organization chart typically just outlines who's in what roles and what they're doing. The accountability chart, and this was sort of loosely taken from the Scaling Up Gazelle's community and EOS traction communities, but the concept that there is a particular role, and there are, maybe 3 to 5 key roles, a particular function, let's say, and 3 to 5 key roles that someone does in that. And the notion is that each one of these organizations, the management organization, the governance organization, the ownership organization, ought to have its own separate accountability chart.
Accountabilities.
With everyone being pretty clear about what are the handful of key roles that they play in that function. So, right. So when clearly as an owner in a business, typically you have a secretary, you have a treasurer, you have a president. What are the key roles? And those are different than, let's say you guys buy an operating company. You're no longer the president, treasurer, and secretary. One person might be the president. 2 people might not even be involved in the operating company whatsoever.
Not at all.
So,
right. Yeah.
So I think I like the idea and the notion that each one of these sort of rooms, as I talked about earlier, would have its own accountability chart. And
that's a really fascinating idea, actually. Maybe we could talk about this a little bit more.
Yeah.
After the podcast, of course. But
yeah, exactly.
Definitely a great idea.
All right. Let's talk about some of the lessons that you've learned. You had a career with a Fortune 500 company. You negotiated, managed, and governed joint ventures with family enterprises across the globe. And you've sit on the boards of some family enterprises in India. What are some lessons that you think are unique to these types of companies?
You spoke about one in the last few minutes, which is it is so important, especially as you get bigger and as you go from first to second to third generation. It is so important to have open discussions about ownership, management, and governance.
Mm-hmm.
Families often resist doing that for a variety of different reasons. And that just builds up over time. The lack of clarity builds up over time. So the families that I've seen that continue to have, enduring success generation after generation are really clear about those three things and have them well documented. The other piece that I find really interesting is that when you're negotiating with a family enterprise, it's a vastly different experience than when you're negotiating with a company of professionals that's widely held.
Mm-hmm.
The skin in the game is different. The timeline around which success is measured is different, and very often reputation effect plays a big part. Family enterprises, especially, are particularly sensitive to the kind of company that they'll end up aligning with and how it would project their image into whatever they consider to be their stakeholder base. So those are two important things, and they're universal. You see them everywhere in the world.
Sure. I was just on a call with Alice Hyman, who's going to join me on a future podcast. She's from the Miller-Hyman family, right, which was a very successful, I'm sure you know it because they were like the Fortune 500 like sales training company. But it's really interesting because we were talking about managing the complex sale. And I'm sure you've been exposed to this concept because when you're selling Fortune 500 to another large company, there's multiple decision makers. Some of them are gatekeepers, some of them are bureaucrats, some of them are stakeholders. And in families, it's not so clear, like exactly what the roles are that some of these different family members play as stakeholders. But it does seem like a joint venture, an exit, a relationship with a family business does require some complexity in terms of managing that sale.
For sure. I mean, it's, there's a combination of, something being family owned and at the same time, perhaps being, let's say, based in Asia versus being based in the US that creates nuances. Mm-hmm. And you've heard this a billion times. I'm not sharing anything groundbreaking here, but the importance of the unofficial channel of communication is so much more important in a family business than it is in, a widely held, professionally run business.
Right.
Just make sure you have the right and open unofficial channels with the people that are really making the decision, not necessarily the ones that are sitting in front of you.
Exactly.
They may be the same, but not always.
Yep. All right. So as we start to wind this down, I want to go back to the family business. You watched your dad, a tremendously successful guy, obviously, rose through the ranks, and you knew upgrowing you were the successor of a family business, but you chose a career as a professional instead. And talk to me about the conversation with yourself and your family around that decision. What was that like?
In retrospect, I would say that I'd be really proud if I turned out to be a little bit like him. Mm-hmm. And by that, I mean fiercely independent, willing to take some risk, and ready to chart my own path in life, mm-hmm. right? And at least at the beginning of my career, I think I was all of those three things. And that pulled me away from the family business because I didn't see myself having enough independence in that environment. And as I pointed out earlier, my dad, I think he always wished that I'd made different choices, but he never thrust them on me. Never once did he thrust them on me. He was always welcoming of my next big gig, at least in my eyes. He was the big guy. I was a junior employee in a Fortune 500 company in upstate New York, but he celebrated my victories with me. So
I'm sure you had a pretty illustrious career with Corning. No slouch of a Fortune 500 company.
That is true.
Right. An innovator, a tech leader. I'm guessing they hold maybe as many patents as 3M or companies like that. So,
and as you pointed out earlier, number 1 or 2 in every industry that we choose to play in.
Wow. Yeah. Amazing.
Sure.
All right. And so any final thoughts on maybe what inspired you to take the lead and transitioning your own family business to the next generation, and maybe some challenges or learnings, or, any other thoughts about what we've been talking about?
Well, I think the choice to sort of enter at the time when I did was partly serendipity. I was there. and partly driven by the fact that I felt that it was my time to contribute. It didn't come from a place of guilt. I'm not very good in the guilt space. It was from a place of, there is a need here. And I think for once in my life, my capability set and the need set have a significant overlap in the Venn diagram. So why don't we do something about this? And so that kind of was the trigger to first join. And really this theme and this thread of family-owned business and how much I've engaged in it didn't really become obvious to me until I separated myself from Corning and found myself teaching and talking to people, around me. And they're like, well, that's family business. Oh, that's family business. And I started to connect the dots. And I said, it's funny, but I look back and I've had so many different flavors of interaction with this concept of family enterprise that I might know a thing or two. So here we are.
Yeah. And so, I had the similar experience where I worked with so many businesses that I called entrepreneurial small businesses. And then I started to recognize, wait, there was more than two members of the enterprise, stakeholders that were, from the family. And a lot of times, sometimes just a small business might have a person might have a spouse involved in some of the decision making, and because of I guess common law, right, that or joint property, at least in California, I'm sure many other states, the spouse owns half the business unless you put it in a trust or
unless stated otherwise, which would be an interesting discussion anyway, right?
Yeah, totally.
Love you, but you don't own anything.
Right. So, well, this has been a thoroughly enjoyable time spent talking with you. I think you're a fascinating man. I think your story is really interesting. I wish you great success at the faculty of Cornell. I'm sure you add a lot of value. And Cornell, by the way, people should know, has one of the leading family business school programs in the country and does some great research in that space. And I had speaker, Dan Vandervliet, who is maybe head of the family business program, is one of my early.
He does run the Smith Family Business Initiative. Yeah. He runs it. He's a great guy. Does a lot of great work.
Fantastic. Yeah. So, Rustom, thanks so much for being on the show today.
Thank you very much for the time. I really appreciate it. It was fun.
All right. So thank you very much, folks. If you like this episode, please subscribe, share it with others, family businesses or otherwise. Thanks for tuning in.
This podcast is sponsored by myself, Jonathan Goldhill, and my company, the Goldhill Group, where we provide coaching for growing companies. I'm Jonathan Goldhill, and my purpose is simple: to guide entrepreneurial leaders in family businesses towards more freedom and fulfillment. I want entrepreneurs to get clarity around the changes that will make them and their businesses more successful so they can experience the same freedom I've enjoyed in my life. Our proven practices challenge business owners to think differently about their business and how they're running it, and quite literally become game changers in our clients' companies. Learn more at thegoldhillgroup.com website, where you can schedule your free strategy session.
Thank you for joining us on the Disruptive Successor Podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe, review, and share with a friend who would benefit from the message. If you're interested in picking up a copy of my book, Disruptive Successor, go to disruptivesuccessor.com.